What's up, Gromies? Welcome to AROYA Office Hours, episode 139, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm your host, Cian, with our Director of Applied Technology, Jason Van Leuven. We're joined today by Liam Spencer, one of our AROYA sales representatives or account executives. And instead of our usual guest interview format, we're going to do a deep dive into some questions that have come in from you guys lately in the community. Liam's not just any sales rep, he's also been on the front lines every day talking to our growers, helping them solve problems and seeing some of the same cultivation challenges come up over and over again. So we kind of thought who better to jump on, do an episode with us and talk about the ins and outs of what's happening out there in the field. Liam, want to give yourself a quick intro and tell everyone who you are?
Hey guys, thanks for having me on here today. I come from a commercial cannabis cultivation background and a horticulture background. I worked with Curaleaf for a couple years and ran a couple small craft cultivations in Denver, Colorado. And then I moved on to being sort of the technical advisor for Science LED before joining AROYA. So, some experience in large scale greenhouse production and small craft indoor production. And I've been involved in the horticultural world probably about 11 years now, starting with doing some hydroponic gardening and community garden work at the University of Central Florida. So that's pretty much my background.
Nice. Well, I know that you've become pretty popular with a lot of our customers out there, and you're on the front lines answering a bunch of those support questions as they come in when people have, things pop up and want to get your 2 cents on the matter. So we appreciate you coming on and doing the same with us today. A lot of fun to have new faces on and get to discuss some of these problems from a different perspective. So appreciate the time today and hope it's fun for you.
Yeah.
So here's the rough format for the day, right? We've got some good questions from the community, a handful of ones that are probably bound to pop in on the chat today. But I want to do a deep dive on a couple of questions that we got in that seem like they'll be a lot of fun for us to kind of throw around for a roundtable discussion.
Good thing we've got you and Liam on the call today, because it seems like I tend to knock them out as short as I can. So we'll let you guys really dig in.
All right. So we got a couple of topics to go with for the day. The first one that really kind of jumped at me was in regards to EC behavior during late flower and kind of what your drybacks are supposed to look like, what your EC behavior is supposed to look like during that late flower ripening stage. And I know that can definitely be confusing for some people when we always talk about going back to generative cues in that regard. And I get a lot of questions personally about what does that mean to go back to generative now that my plants are so big? Do you guys see similar questions on a regular basis?
Yeah. I'll kick it off, Liam.
Yeah.
I almost always tell people that ripening is probably one of the hardest of the segments to advise on. It's one of those things where, hey, we're running out of time. And so the choices that we have, the levers to pull as far as our effect on the plant at this point are somewhat limited, especially when we talk about the root zone and EC and stuff. Obviously, environmental parameters are absolutely key to maintaining some dense buds, making sure we don't see foxtailing, trying to get as much anthocyanin production as we can out of those last 10 days, 2 weeks of the cycle. And so it's really critical that obviously we're doing those aspects, and we're also trying to prevent any mold growth as far as those buds are getting huge. A lot of times our canopies are getting really thick, and we're waiting until that last pre-harvest defol in order to really get things cleaned up. And I think there is some more to this question as well. But, in general, we are trying to run some generative strategies, and that can be a serious challenge depending on our substrate size. If we've on the smaller side of the substrate size, then typically we may have to actually push some additional irrigations depending on our substrate type. I guess I was working with some guys in Rockwool slabs, and they're hitting 10% for last 10, 14 days. And they're like, we're actually just running out of field capacity and stuff here. And obviously when we're in Rockwool, 10% is not going to hurt the plant at all, because we still have tons of available water. Our matrix potential is not necessarily cueing that plant for any damage at that point. But we do have to maintain a high enough water content that we're not going to be running out of field capacity before the end of it. So what I should intro there was obviously when Rockwool, we dry it back too much, we start to lose that field capacity. Some hydrophobic effects take hold in that substrate. And so really the recommendation there was just, all right, let's not push those huge drybacks until the last, say, 7 days. EC, yeah, you're going to see some huge dynamics, and we'll get into that part of the question here after Liam speaks.
Yeah, no, that was a great summary, Jason. I think, there's a little bit of confusion in ripening that a lot of people have around substrate EC, particularly, managing drybacks and EC at the same time, particularly if your input EC is tapering down. A lot of people have different preferences on their input EC, and I think that's one of the bigger drivers on osmotic potential in the root zone with ripening. Some people like to flush, some people like to, do different things, but don't necessarily understand exactly the impact that might have. One of the core components of ripening is high osmotic potential in the root zone. So if you're driving high EC, that's more of a generative stimulus on the plant. And I think that's something that people kind of get confused where they're trying to taper EC down in the root zone at the end because they want to try to flush it out. But that's not necessarily the most ideal generative cue on the plant.
And I'm glad you brought up one of my least favorite words, because a lot of what that EC strategy has to do with is whether we are reducing our amounts of nitrogens. Anytime that we're doing some type of strategy, we always need to keep our goal in mind, right? And so the goal of the old flushing, there you go, I said it, is to reduce the amount of carbohydrates and sugars that are accumulated into our flour specifically. And the goal there is obviously get a cleaner smoke. Always go for that nice white ash that people are shooting for. We can do that a little bit by keeping higher ECs and making sure that the nitrogen supply is limited to the plant. And that's where, we see, commercial products that are replacing the typical base, which has that calcium nitrate component, and replacing it with a calcium chloride type component. For all the Athena fanboys out there, that's the Fade product, probably one of the most known on there. So if we're not talking scientific, that application wise, that's probably what you're familiar with doing. And when we are not replacing our nitrogen, that's kind of where the traditional flush approach came from. Is, all right, well, we can get rid of our nitrogen by just not giving the plant any nutrients or very, very low amounts of nutrients. Unfortunately, when we do that, we're limiting its growth potential as well. We're limiting some of the micronutrients that are absolutely essential in the full maturity of our ability to produce high THCs, high cannabinoid, any of that chemotype, the chemical profile of that flower. So, anytime that we start talking about ripening it, we have to understand, are we doing a procedure that's reducing the amounts of nitrogen in the substrate and plant? We're not building as many sugars and carbohydrates to that plant because it doesn't need to store them for growth in the future.
Yeah, and I think one more thing to sort of add to that is, with the concept of tapering EC down towards the end of flower, a lot of that could definitely be related to playing with different runoff volumes and different quantities of leachate out of the substrate. And, if you're not tracking that closely, you could be accidentally driving too much of your EC down because the plant's potentially drinking less towards the end and its demand for water goes down. So you could be, if you're not adjusting your inputs and paying close attention to your runoff, you could see EC tapering downwards just as a result of that.
Great point. Probably one of the biggest challenges that I have when talking about ripening EC is our ECs typically get to be very dynamic during ripening, right? Especially if we are tapering nutrient input, which can be a really nice strategy, to be honest, even if we are getting rid of our nitrogen in there. I do like to taper a little bit towards that end, towards the very end. And when we have such dynamic ECs, we get a question like, "Oh, what should my EC be in ripening?" It's like, well, it could be 3 or 4, and it could be 12, all in the same day, right? And those dynamics are very typical with the dryback, and that's kind of where this question is going a little bit. That we're going to get into the second half just a minute. It's also why time series data is so important when we start to think about turning the knobs, really tweaking what we're doing in our ripening to get the best out of the plant. If we're going in there and taking a spot measurement on EC, depending on when we hit that, there could be such a massive range of what those ECs are going to come out as. When we're able to analyze those dynamics, when we're able to see what is that EC doing throughout the day, we get a lot more options as far as making it better and making changes in the variables that we're doing to optimize our flower output.
Yeah, and I think tying back into what you mentioned earlier about Rockwool, I think I've found when I'm looking at data from some of our customers that the ones who have lost a bit of their field capacity in the Rockwool see much more dynamic ECs in their substrate, particularly towards the end as well, just because that ratio of water to salinity is so dynamic.
I love that breakdown too that you guys both contributed to there, of talking about how the ultimate goal is to reduce nitrogen levels in there, and whether or not your strategy to do so is to reduce your input levels bit by bit towards the last few days there, where you're starting to really draw that through into its ripening phase, or whether you have been more on that traditional lush clean water approach that Jason's so fond of. If either direction, right, what you're doing essentially is trying to draw that nitrogen level in your substrate down a little bit, so that you are encouraging that product to finish and to harden and to get the full potential out of what you've planted. And I think that helping people to understand why they're doing what they're doing, from the traditional standpoint of the flush concept, or from the metered approach of dialing down your nutrient inputs over time, is really important, because a lot of people that I talk to don't necessarily understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's just what's worked for them over time. So I think that that's really important to communicate, and I think it's a really juicy piece of information for people to pay attention to in there.
One thing I wanted to add is, do you guys often see as well on the Terros 1 data where overnight, when you see your overnight dryback, I find when the EC is pretty low, sometimes you'll see tapering downwards with the dryback, sort of in tandem or in parallel with the dryback. So that's sort of something that I've noticed fairly infrequently, but still present. And I think that might be something that some growers are probably asking questions about too.
Yeah, you kind of brought us into the second segment there of this question. I did want to share, do a little screen share. Probably been a while since we've put some actual stuff on the screen here. So when I talked about those dynamics, let's see if we can share screen, and if our awesome producer Chris over here can get me on the screen here. We'll show some actual data here from one of our partner facilities. And this is the last 5-6 days of the cycle. And these guys do a great job. Actually, probably a little bit less dynamics than I see some places. But here, yeah, we can see, okay, after irrigations, they're getting down to that, say, 3 to 4 EC, which is fantastic. I mean, that's a great place to be in your root zone during ripening. Sometimes, sure, we could go a little bit lower, maybe for the last few days. But for a cannabis plant, most of these things are pretty hungry. And so anytime we start getting too low in EC, it's going to be starving that plant and or asking for some amount of deficiencies. And one of the things, this question, I think probably the most important reply to the question that we have here, where they're seeing their EC drop during drybacks, is what are some of the absolute values, right? Where is our feed EC at? Where is our root zone EC at? Because anytime that our plants are eating more nutrients than what is available in the root zone, and or what we are supplying, we're going to see that EC drop, right? It's just going to happen. Those plants are eating nutrients faster than we are supplying them. And from my perspective, that's really never a good thing at any point. Probably at the end, it's not as bad as any other part of the cycle, because a lot of this plant has built up some of the chemicals that it needs to catalyze into the final products, those final chemicals that we're looking for out of the cannabis plant. And obviously it's not going to have a long-term impact on the growth, productivity of it. But that still being said, if we had an idea of where those absolute values are, if I am actually flushing, and let's say my feed EC is 0 or 0.5, depending if I'm RO or municipal or well water, for example, then and our substrate's down at 2 EC, there's a very good chance that the plant is actually drawing the substrate to almost no nutrient content.
Yeah, that definitely shifts the osmotic balance too, and the ionic balance in the substrate. That can be definitely counterintuitive, I've seen, or at least counterproductive. I've seen in cases where you're driving everything out, you're changing the osmotic pressure too in the cells of the plant, and that's where you can get a lot of risk for mold in the tissue.
Do we want to talk? Do we want to dive into osmotic potential, or do we want to keep rolling here?
I think for the moment we'll keep rolling on this one for a little bit here, because I think it's a common enough question we get from people, especially in regards to that drop in EC as you're watching your plant. What would normally be a little bit of a rise throughout the day become a dip for you. And a lot of people get really alarmed by that, and it is alarming. You know what I mean? Like, you look at that and you're like, oh my gosh, what's happening here? And one of the first things, and I think you pointed this out, or at least pointed to the data point there, that I always talk to them about. I'm like, what did you change your feed EC to recently? And more often than not, they've just gone through a big reduction in their feed EC that maybe was a little more drastic than they should have maybe gone right off the bat. And as a result, they're seeing less available nutrients for that plant to be able to use up throughout its photo period. And well, just like you said, that's going to happen. That decline on the graph of your EC values is the natural result of having not enough nutrients there for your plant when it's hungry enough to blow through what's there.
And then you blow through the flower after you cut it. Chris laughed.
Yeah, this question came in from one of our Instagram followers. Essentially, he was saying that he's saying when he's pushing hard drybacks towards the end of flower, that's exactly what happens. And this customer specifically, I think, was an AROYA Go customer that was noticing this and really wasn't sure what to make of those numbers. And oftentimes, that's what we find is, if we dig into that a little bit, there's some changes that have happened in their input EC values, or potentially how they've decided to irrigate their plants. And sometimes one of the things that I find is that they're really hung up on this idea of moving back to a generative steering cue, and what that means in relationship to their understanding of generative steering in the first couple of weeks versus what we're seeing towards the end of the round, and how much they can really press that gas pedal of generative stress, so to speak, in those last couple of weeks.
Man, you guys are getting to me today. Stress and flush and everything. Let's take one step back and talk a little bit about our goals of doing generative type of crop steering towards ripening. Like, why are we doing this, right? And Sure, there is going to be some strain dependency, and I'll bring up the anecdote of some pineapple that I used to grow, and pretty much it seemed like no matter what I did with that stuff, it was foxtailing at the end, right? Like beyond a nice crown that we would think of as a reasonably attractive type of foxtailing, right? We're looking at bud elongation beyond what we want to put in a bag or a jar. So that's probably one of the really big reasons, right? Anytime that we do multiple irrigations, every time we're doing a irrigation event to that plant, we're bringing a fresh oxygen, fresh nutrients. We're giving a cue to the plant to basically bulk out. I mean, that's why we call it vegetative bulking for the middle of the cycle. And in this case, that bulking toward the end, a lot of times we're going to see fresh white / clear hairs on the plant. We're not going to get that nice uniform amber development across the bud, and its actual morphology is typically less desirable. Now, on certain strains, they're much less likely to express that type of stuff if we can't stick with a good generative. Let's say we're in 6x6 Hugos and we're trying to do a bigger plant. It's like, all right, well, we got to kind of stretch things out or do some emergency irrigations to keep this substrate from zeroing out on water content. And then the other thing there is thinking about, matching this plant's end of life, its end of cyanescence cues, right? And so if we can aid in its maturity, sometimes we can cut a few days off of the cycle. There's a lot of plants that, we would typically run it, say, 10 weeks. A lot of times we can get them down in 9 weeks if we do a great job with our generative type of steering towards the end of the cycle. So, those are really some of the main reasons that we're going with the generative approach during the ripening, say last 1 to 2 weeks, 10 days, 14 days.
Yeah, I see so many of my customers getting lost in that last phase too, like you had mentioned earlier, Jason. And I think what a lot of times they're probably looking not zoomed out enough and looking too deep into these specific triggers and cues that they think that they're chasing, without really understanding the principles that drive what we're trying to accomplish here. So I appreciate that insight. That's helpful.
I also appreciate that you wanted to take the time to break that down, because I was kind of baiting you there a little bit. I hope you don't mind, Jason.
Oh man, you just got to spell it out for me sometimes.
I get so many questions to that effect, right? Where people are like, I'm trying to stress the plant out right now, right? And I'm like, not necessarily, no. You're definitely trying to transition back into what you would consider a generative style steering strategy. But if you're hitting temporary wilting point as a result of trying to push the gas pedal, so to speak, a little too hard on your plants, you're definitely not going to make that plant perform better in its last couple of weeks. And hope you don't mind me baiting you into explaining the ins and outs of why we're doing what we're doing and going into that generative steering strategy, the ripening stage there. Because I just find it such a confusing thing for so many people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, maybe we just want to go out there and actually just talk about stress, right? When we are working in agriculture, horticulture, especially, where we have the ability to manipulate that and sometimes play on the edges of stress, there's two main stressor factors. When we look at traditional crops, most of the time we're talking about a drought stress, right? And a drought stress, it actually has less to do with water content and much more to do with matrix potential. And this is because this is why cannabis is super fun, is because a ton of our clients are all hydroponic. We've got cocoa or Rockwool, some type of peat mix, right? And that means that we actually know when those matrix potentials are getting low, we can chart those in specific to water contents, right? So when we're looking at water content for cocoa, for example, we usually start to see, some type of stressor events at about 15 to 20% volumetric water content. And that's simply because the properties of those substrates they're related to how much they're holding on to that water, right? And when we're talking about a drought stressor, the plant is applying a vacuum to this substrate. And when it has to apply too much vacuum, we can start to see temporary wilting point, depending on if the osmotic, the Tugger pressure, the osmotic difference, we'll talk about osmotic in just a minute, but the Tugger pressure of those cells is able to apply enough vacuum to the substrate in order to pull the water out, right? Now, if we get to a point where it's actually not able to survive at the amount of water that it's pulling out, so we have a very negative matrix potential because it's a pressure, so vacuum would be negative. Then that's when we start to hit a permanent wilting point. A permanent wilting point is going to set in on that plant at different areas of the plant, right? It's going to set in certain areas, and as that plant becomes closer to being completely dead, it'll set into the entire plant where we see that permanent wilting point. Temporary wilting point is the fun one. This is where we can apply some drought stressors, especially in more traditional types of crops. And that can actually aid in changing the plant's hormone balance. It aids us in basically steering the plant physiology. And we love the term crop steering here in the cannabis industry because a lot of times we didn't necessarily have enough history and enough growing guidelines. There wasn't the transparency on plant behavior, and a lot of this stuff was just happening behind closed doors, where the demand for any type of smokable product was so high that we didn't necessarily need to dive into them, right? That being said, in hydroponics, when we're playing with temporary wilting point, it's one of those things where we actually may not have to. There's another type of, I don't know if stressor, we'll call it stressor. I wish I could come up with a better word because that's not my favorite. I usually like to talk specifically about, the actual biology that's going on that's causing the change. But sure, when we are working with osmotic differential, and you can hear Liam saying osmotic potential, I like to refer to it to a differential because we're referencing the osmotic pressure in the substrate and the osmotic pressure in the plant itself. Typically the osmotic pressure in the plant, the salt content in the plant is going to be at a higher concentration than in the substrate. And it until we get to really high ECs in the substrate, which we typically try to avoid that. But that osmotic differential, as we raise our ECs, it decreases, right? And so that can affect things like Tugger pressure. It does affect a little bit of our water and nutrient uptake as well. And so by manipulating our salt concentration in the substrate, we can basically modulate how that plant responds.
Yeah, that's good clarity there. I think that is really useful. I think, you taught me a while back to use the term stimulus on the plant as opposed to stress, because when you get to a point of stress, typically we're doing damage to the plant. And there's plenty of data and research out there to support that drought stress in cannabis specifically and hydro can actually be counterproductive to yields and quality. But yeah, riding that line is more of what we're kind of targeting, I think is what you're getting at too.
Good backup.
I'm happy you guys got into that a little bit because that's another one, just the terminology of stress, right? I really hope people start to use the idea of stimulus or steering cues rather than the idea that what you're doing is always stressful to the plant, because like you guys are saying, stress implies that plant is going through something that is not necessarily going to be inherently positive to the net outcome that we're working towards. And I think it's good to get to a position where we start to differentiate what we're doing in terminology from stressing the plant, which sometimes maybe we are doing just that but also looking at, are we stressing it or are we giving it signals? Are we stimulating it to do a specific thing? Are we looking to, elicit a response from the plant? And I think that sometimes might be a better way to start talking about those subjects than the traditional, stress that we hear from people so often.
It's kind of reminds me of a really cool research study that I heard about at a conference one time, and these people were actually intentionally inducing pest pressures into cannabis in order to see the response, right? And sure, you could say, okay, well, this is a stressor on the plant or whatever. And really, the reason that I'm bringing this up is because it's a response from the plant where they actually saw higher THC concentrations, a little bit higher chemical output from the plant in defense of the pest pressure that was applied in this case. No recommendations to do this kind of thing out there, guys, but just these plants can respond to types of environmental factors that we get to manipulate in indoor horticulture or mixed light horticulture.
Yeah, I think without even using pests, you can probably induce the same thing through some organic compounds like chitosan or some of these more typical, organic additives that people use to stimulate the ISR and SAR pathways in the plant. Without having, that's sort of something we could learn from the extremes of like what you're talking about, where we're heavier pest pressure. What is the driving mechanism in the plant producing more compounds that way? And can we do that while also driving higher plant health?
That's a great addition, Liam. I think that could almost be a whole separate discussion unto itself. Before we get too deep into that one, though, I do have another direction I want to take our conversation for the day, because I think we could probably get lost pretty quick there. So the other big topic I wanted to cover today is in response to a couple of different discussions that Liam and I have had lately that have to do with commercial irrigation uniformity and troubleshooting problems that occur at large scale when you don't see uniformity in your VWC readings or in your drybacks, potentially what that might mean when you're looking around your facility, and how to identify some of these issues. So the question I got in here from our cultivator is, I'm currently growing on a 32-foot bench with about 68 to 75 plants per bench using NetFM 1 gal per hour emitters. I'm seeing that the fronts and backs of the tables are always running 15 to 20% higher than in the middle of the tables. Our emitter tests look good and consistent, but it's not translating once the plants are in benches. We see this quite a bit. Liam, I know you and I, like I said, have had some conversations recently to this effect. Wanted to throw this out to you guys and have you guys each kind of break down what you think might be going on here for this person. One thing to note in here, he does at some point say moisture content. I'm fairly certain he's referring to VWC. So throw that out if you're looking at that. Jason, let's kick it off with you, man. What do you think?
Yeah. I'm just going to hit on the two things that I see most. This is separate of the question. This is just kind of based on, talking about your intro there on the question. Plant uniformity in scaled agriculture. Well, when we are using sensor to analyze it, the two issues that I run into still fairly commonly is difficulty with sensor installation. So if we're using round hard pots and we don't get that sensor flush with the media, if we're not doing a great job getting that sensor in level and completely flush with the substrate at the height that's recommended for those, we're going to see variations in the readings. And that's a false representation of the actual variation that's going on there. So we need to make sure that the tools that we're using to evaluate uniformity are truthful and are giving us a representative sample of that system. And this is really where looking at sensor densities, I know I did a video about that a couple of years ago when we're looking at populations and how to analyze that and get a good average and what to do there. And then the other difficulty that we can have is it's sensor installation, and then I forgot my other one. It'll come back to me by the end of the question here. But to answer your question part of it is, a lot of times we're looking at canopy uniformity. So center of benches, we're getting less exposure to light. Sometimes we got less airflow in there. And so we're seeing less evaporation, less transpiration, less radiant, less radiation on those plants in the middle.
Yeah, I think one clarification I would like to have from this question is, are we talking 15 to 20% less dryback, or are we talking overall 15 to 20% less field capacity? I guess I was a little confused. He's saying I'm seeing 15 to 20% higher moisture content on the edges than in the middles, and meaning if under the assumption that means that he's drying back harder in the middle, that could be a function of what kind of lights is he using? Is he using HPS? Is he using high bay LEDs? Are we using, grid lights? Are we seeing higher intensity, maybe higher transpiration in the middle? Or I guess that's something that I'm trying to understand is, which direction are we going with the water content here?
I'm glad you
said that observation.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I was thinking of it backwards. Most everyone has the opposite, where the middle is higher moisture content. So I'm super glad that you said that, which makes me actually think of something else. And that would be, possibly is the microclimate in the center of the canopy.
I wonder about inner canopy ventilation.
Yeah, is our VPD more ideal towards the middle, so we're seeing those higher transpiration rates?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's kind of what I was wondering.
I was going to say that climate's going to be the huge factor one way or another, and planting density and volume of substrate in that area. Because if you got higher leaf density and higher, biomass density in the middle, that definitely will impact it. In the converse way of saying, hey, we may have higher biomass density, we may have higher drinking rates in there, or if we're having less light penetration, we may see less water consumption. So just really clarifying which direction that we're trying to, it's probably most likely environmentally related, not pressure or dripper related. But again, that's predicated on which direction we're going with the water content.
Yeah. And you nailed it. If we are able to group things by some specific variable, in this case, he's mentioned that the grouping is by area. Typically emitters are going to clog at some amount across it if we have a good irrigation setup. That being said, occasionally, depending on how we have that set up, so if we, for example, have end runs, a lot of times we're going to see less pressure down here at the end of these runs, right? The black is the bench, the blue is our irrigation supply for those drippers, right? And so anytime that we're doing that type of stuff, we always want to do a complete circuit for that irrigation. That's going to just basically help all of that stuff even out, right? And a lot of times it's really good to have a flush down here at the end as well. That being said, obviously emitters are very easy to check, as he talked about. So that's I think most of what we've got to help him here. He's backwards. Most people see the higher water content in the middle.
Yeah, I guess if you were seeing lower water content in the middle, it would just be, are we having more ideal transpiration happening? Or, the pressure testing saying, hey, we pressure tested, we think that the emitter are not the issue. The protocols for testing those emitters too, trying to understand, hey, how many samples are we collecting off of the emitters? Can we completely rule out clogging as a potential factor here? Because it's less likely that you'll have clogging in the middle of the line, as kind of you said, Jason, as opposed to towards the end of the line, unless you have, some confounding factors there. So this is a little bit of a tricky one to look at from sort of the other angle, because I agree with you. I think most of the time we would see lower transpiration in the middle.
Other things to consider here. We've really given this guy all the options in the book to go investigate, but locations of HVAC equipment, right? Are we seeing the AC outputs all towards the edges or something, right? Are there dehume towards the middle, heat output towards the middle, that type of stuff? How much airflow do we have? Really, so that HVAC dynamics are very important as far as where we're running. And as Liam mentioned, are we looking at 15 to 20% across the board? Usually, if we see an offset like that, let's say, give me just a minute to draw some stuff here. So let's say 65 and 45, and then sorry guys, I am not that fast.
Yeah, and one thing real quick is the fans. I think we underestimate the impact of horizontal airflow versus oscillating fans and their impact in a canopy just because of the sheer wind pressure. I think this was something that was addressed in a previous episode with Anders, but just talking about like the oscillating fans are really pushing most of that air on the outside. So that would make sense where you might see more transpiration, either more or less, depending on the velocity of that air at the edge of that canopy too.
I was kind of thinking too, I've seen several places over the years, not necessarily bigger commercial facilities as often, but every once in a while, that have used those high velocity room dryer fans to move a lot of air under their canopy that would otherwise be not quite as efficiently mixing into the air column, right? And I kind of wonder about that. Like maybe this person has some directional airflow moving through the center. I think something like that might be encouraging extra transpiration like that.
All right, now we got some representation. I actually just started the question with some graphics because it always helps us think and helps other people see what we're thinking. So as Liam had mentioned, are we talking about the graph on the left or the graph on the right, where field capacity on this one, for example, we're seeing it much, much lower. Anytime that we are working with similar substrate in a room, we should typically see these field capacities be pretty much spot on when we start the cycle. It's cool, that some of that sample data I was showing you earlier, they were plus or minus like 1.5% on the consistency of their field capacity when they started their one of those runs in the room. They were running a cocoa product there, one of my favorites, Kayakora, and I was amazed. Like most of the time when I see water contents, I'm pretty happy if I'm plus or minus like 5% across a 1,000 square foot room. Say 10 sensors. Well, that's pretty reasonable, right? We can make good decisions off an average for that, or even group decisions. So if we are looking at this one, sorry, I was off screen. It was probably more likely a system issue, right? Did we do a shitty job hydrating our substrate? Did we have a hard time installing the sensors? If we were middle of the row rather than middle of the column, like he's talking here, maybe it's just harder to do a good job installing the sensors because we got to reach in there. There's less visibility, that type of stuff. And so if it's this case, it definitely want to dive in and take a look at that type of stuff. If we are at this case over here, this is definitely plant response, right? So this is actually a different amount of transpiration. So when we're seeing drybacks, they're very rough estimate graphs today, y'all. These are different amounts of drybacks, right? So this a lot of times can indicate a plant health. This is plant response, right? Our red plant's simply not consuming nearly as much water, or we're seeing significantly less evaporation from this plant up here as well. So if we do nail it down to saying, hey, this one's transpiring quite a bit less, then we really got to dive into cloning consistency is one of the first things I always like to look into in uniformity. how well has our process helped our plants stay the same up to that point? And then just, general plant health things.
Yeah, I think one of the things about the graph on the left is that's probably more likely to happen, on you're right. That's probably more than likely a Rockwool scenario. If you're delivering too large of shots or too frequent of events, you can lose field capacity more easily if you're having that's a compounding effect of having inconsistent transpiration too, is maybe your substrate doesn't have the same dynamics within it because you're just not allowing the plant to dry back enough, or maybe too much. So either way, Rockwool is very sensitive in field capacity on intervals and shot sizes once you dry back to a certain point.
Glad you brought that up, because that's definitely one of the scenarios that I see that graph Jason had on this right there the most frequently, is when people have done some combination of issue with either their shot sizes, the intervals in between the shots, or the total volume applied to their Rockwool over the period of time they were trying to use as their irrigation window. And glad you brought that up, because that's definitely one of the more frequent calls I've received recently on, why am I seeing so much variability across this facility, room to room, tray to tray within the room? And a lot of times those Rockwool clients that have that type of variability may have damaged their Rockwool and dried back be below that floor. And as a result, they're now seeing a different field cap and a different delta on their dry back than what they had going previously. And so I think it's worth pointing out that can definitely be substrate dependent as well.
Yeah, you and I just did troubleshoot an exact case like that in Michigan recently, where they were running slabs and they were seeing a range of about 40 to 80, 75 to 80% in field capacity in the room. And they were just very confused as to, is it a sensor issue? Is it a substrate? They didn't really understand these concepts. So I think this is really pertinent, because we just solved this problem like last week.
If you are using data-driven horticulture principles, getting your field capacity up, getting your substrate saturated appropriately is probably one of the most important things that you can do to set yourself up for successful flower. One of the most important things during flower that you can do. If you have inconsistencies there and you don't get them sorted out immediately, you're just going to be chasing your tail. The data is going to start to steer you in the wrong direction as far as some of this stuff goes. And a lot of times your uniformity is going to get even worse from there. So when you think about, all right, if we had really good cloning consistency, well, let's keep up our hard work and do a really good job with saturating our substrate. There's a lot of great SOPs out there published straight from companies like Rodan on how to get your slabs substrate or your slabs saturated. Read them, follow them, enforce them, and then look at your graphs and verify that stuff's been followed.
That's a great point. I really like to encourage people, watch that data and trust the data, because this is another one of those scenarios where whenever I see big inconsistencies, it's usually because the sensors are giving you a red flag to pay attention to. And this is one of those scenarios where, rather than look at the sensor and say, this value is erroneous, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, it must be wrong. I always like to take opportunities, especially with my own sensors, and say, if it's telling me something, I have done something wrong that has gotten me where I am, because I've almost never ran into a scenario where the sensor has been incorrect. I actually can't think of a sensor that has been entirely incorrect yet, unless it was broken. So that's one of those scenarios where I'm like, hey, this is a chance to go in, take a look at what's happening, and try to correct some sort of inconsistency that's happening that is in your SOPs or how you're handling this irrigation strategy within your system.
One of the really cool things about cannabis crops is when we are doing cloning, we do a good job of these processes. They are typically very uniform, right? Biologically speaking, genetically speaking, these plants are destined to grow about as alike as almost anything in production of any biological production that people work on. And so if we can keep up a good job on that, it actually gives us more time as a gardener and more ability. Anything that is wrong stands out, right? I was working with a new client yesterday that they hadn't quite gotten to a point where their irrigations were consistent day to day. And I was like, I just kept asking questions. Well, what's going on with this irrigation? What's going on with this irrigation? And sure, they all had great answers for the situation they were in. But that being said, when we can establish uniformity, things that are going wrong, things that need maintenance, need to be addressed, corrected, they start to stick out like a sore thumb, right? And that happens both with uniformity and with consistency.
Yeah, I think to caveat that, or at least, sort of on the flip side of that, having very little uniformity within your canopy makes data-driven and precision decision-making very difficult. If you don't have representative plants in your group and your deltas are pretty substantial, then you're not able to really utilize our data accurately to make those decisions, and that makes it very challenging, because then that compounds over the flower cycle. Certain plants drink less than others, certain other plants may drink more than the average, and when your variance increases so much, your ability to manage the entire ship as a whole becomes much more limited.
I always like to tell people when I get on the phone with them that the sensors are only as accurate as you are consistent with them. And if you do not pay attention to what you are doing with them to take measurements, the measurements that you take will not mean as much to you. And so that's kind of one of the big things I try to harp on right at the beginning when I get people onboarded into taking a lot of these measurements and paying attention to sensor-driven decision-making and the in-situ data feeds that we provide them is like, this is an opportunity for you to really dig into why you're doing what you're doing and how to prevent you from making big mistakes that could potentially, cost you if you are not looking at this and paying attention.
Yeah, and we don't have time to jump in the slides today, but great video that talked a lot about this stuff. Here, I'm pushing myself. You judge the video. I thought I did a good job on talking about crop uniformity and sensor density, basically bringing up some of this stuff as far as any of those things that we talked about with some graphics that might help kind of connect with how other people see these things. So we've got pictures of, multiple cultivar crops. We got pictures of heat gradients in rooms, clogged drippers, all that type of stuff. So go check out this video. It's been out there for looks like 3 years now. Good way to think about this stuff as well as populations go.
Yeah, and I think the data also reveals a lot of the inconsistencies within the crop and canopy as well. So having the data allows you to understand how big of a variance you might have within your system as well.
That's another great point. It's a good way to be able to gauge, is this affecting just a handful of plants or areas in my facility, or is this a scale problem that I'm seeing across the board in every room? And, if so, what am I doing? What's producing this?
And it doesn't come just down to sensor data as well. If you're doing a good job looking at if your metric state and you have some of those compliance, that track and trace data, or if you're just doing a good job internally with some of this process management type stuff, we can look at, maybe Jason's not a very good cloner, and those plants over there were ones that he cut. Let's get him doing something else or find him a new job. That type of stuff is is there something related to a specific mom that these plants came from, right? So the better that we can identify that variable, and in this case he was talking about the middle of the bench, probably actually a spatial variable in this chance, but a lot of times that comes down to, traceable process actions that happened earlier on as well in the plant's life.
Well, I'd love to go a little further into some of those traceable process actions, because I know that paying attention to a few of those details, so to speak, is how a lot of those big mistakes get solved early on. Finding your way into consistent and really stable practices that you can repeat over and over again that are producing quality, consistent results can be a big battle that people fight when they're not paying attention to some of those early aspects that you are talking about, like, your cloning consistency in your early plant life. And while I would love to jump further into that, I think that'll get us into another half-hour discussion, which maybe we should save for our next time on air. But I want to just first, before we start closing out, thank Liam for coming on today. This was a blast, man. Hope you come join us more often.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I definitely appreciate it. Hopefully I added some value to the discussion for everybody.
Absolutely. What do you think, Jason?
So stoked to have Liam on. He's a good dude. Like, he'd fool you. You wouldn't think he was a salesperson when you meet and hang out with him and stuff, but he's a good one. So it's our lucky day.
On here might want to take you out for a date, Liam.
Anytime, Jason.
Oh, man. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for jumping on today. That's episode 139 of Office Hours. Thank you, Liam, for jumping in, bringing us your perspective on everything today, both agronomically and I hope it helps encourage people to understand that our salespeople, don't just talk the talk, they walk the walk. So give Liam a call, set up a demo. That way you guys can see what we're about firsthand. Gromies, keep those questions coming. The deep dive format is something we might do a little bit more of. I'm having a lot of fun doing it. I hope you guys have been enjoying it, Jason, Liam, and I know we've gotten some good comments from people taking a few of the customer questions a little bit slower and diving into them a little bit more deeply, so we can hopefully give you guys some good value. If you guys have some more questions for us, please shoot them over for us at either sales@aroya.io, or you can slide into our DMs on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. If you're loving the podcast, please leave us a review, subscribe, or give us a couple comments on YouTube. Tell us what's up. We'll see you guys on the next episode of Office Hours Live, on episode 140. Thanks so much for stopping in.